I'll just get the housekeeping stuff out of the way to start with. So first of all, this little webinar will be aimed at people who have little or no familiarity with Off2Class, or for those more experienced teachers who are using Off2Class but perhaps just want a little refresh or some new ideas about how to use the content in a more adaptive way. As anybody who uses a curriculum knows, it can become a little bit dry when you're doing the same thing over and over again. So I hope to give you some ideas that will freshen up what you're doing with various students. What will be covered, essentially the points that you can see, I'll go through each of those one by one, but we'll look at the actual audio controls that we have in the system. I'll be talking about why we have graded texts in curriculum and the authenticity factor, looking at student instructions and the importance of students having the right language to kind of control you as well as they go through a listening activity. What I believe is one of the most important things with listening activities is combining it with note-taking, and that means pen and paper. And then we'll get on to the actual skills. If you look at the pre-listening, listening for gist, or listening for the general information, then listening for specific information, probably the topic as the task as native speakers that we apply every time that we listen to anything whatsoever. We don't necessarily catch every single word, but we're always looking for specific information. And then a couple of things that appear in listening activities specifically for ESL students, which are linking words and signpost language that might be more absent in speech between native speakers. And then a couple of points that I just want to touch on for those of you who are teaching students at a higher proficiency. One is looking at the author's opinion, or the speaker's opinion, I guess I should say in this case, and another one is perhaps the tone and intonation and how that can really help boost particularly students at higher proficiency, higher levels of proficiency, who may be going on to something like a TOEFL or an IELTS type situation. Okay, so before I start, I just want to personally mention how much I love teaching listening activities. The one thing that you can take a little break, if you like. You can't sit back and do nothing when you're teaching and just click the play button, but there is a bit of break time when you're doing a listening activity. So never forget the fact that you can become a little bit passive and be listening to the activity at the same time, thinking of things to ask the student after the listening recording itself has finished. I'd be interested to hear, and I just want to mention as well that after this webinar, we probably won't have time for a one-on-one, a question and answer, but I think Chris will mention, as I want to hear that the Facebook, this will be on Facebook, and if people want to ask more specific questions, I'll be more than happy to go into those if I can. So the first thing I want to point out, if you're not familiar with Off2Class, is if there is a listening activity on the slide, the controls will appear at the top. If there is no listening activity, there are no controls at the top. It's pretty straightforward. The controls themselves are very easy to use. You've got a rewind button and the play button. You've got, I've forgotten what this is called in dev speak, but you've got basically this will load as the audio recording plays. You've got the countdown, which will play in reverse down to 0. And then very importantly, you've got the little book icon. And when you click on the book icon, you as the teacher will be able to see the transcript. This is hugely advantageous for you as the teacher, because while the student is listening, you can actually go in and think of things in advance, perhaps to extend the activity already. You might know the student so well that they're interested in certain vocabulary. If it's a student who's already pointed out that they like learning new vocabulary, you might be able to see as they're going along, there are other things to come back to here. You might want to focus on particular phrases or verb forms, tenses that are used. So it's something for you to, as you're going through and the student's listening for particular answers, you might want to go through and get familiar as much as you can. But we've also put it there so that if you haven't had a lot of time to, the idea behind Off2Class is to save you time. And by doing that, you can listen along with us at the same time as a student, but have a bit more information. We don't make the transcript available for students And the reason for that is these are for listening activities. You want to activate the students' listening skills or encourage them to use their listening skills by providing the transcript to the student. Obviously, it becomes primarily a reading exercise. And the other thing is that for students who are focused primarily on accuracy, they will not progress with their listening skills. As I mentioned before, when we listen to anything in day-to-day speech, our recall is limited. That's because we can't recall things verbatim because we are listening for specific information. And that's a skill that students should be replicated when we're doing listening skills. Don't turn it into a reading activity unless you want it to be so. But I think that's a caution there for wanting to always provide the transcript to the students at the same time. Okay, a couple of notes on authenticity. It's very common in the ESL world to want to give students what is known as authentic texts. And obviously what I'm speaking now is authentic English, but whether it's really appropriate for all of your students is questionable. And so I think there are questions around anything that has been written by us obviously goes into a curriculum. And in a sense, it's not authentic. We are providing language at a particular level so that the students will still be able to complete a task at the end of it. And so texts are inauthentic and graded for the very reason that you want to start off with phrases that students will understand. You want students to understand about 80 to 90%. And they're looking for stretching their brains that little bit further to fill in the gaps as they're going along. And that applies to almost any activity. Any reading text should be the same. You don't want them to be so complicated. And so it does give rise to having to remove some of the complexity that appears in native speaker writing and speech. One thing you're going to notice, excuse me, in listening activities is that there will be increased repetition. That's to allow the student more time to actually understand what's going on. And with increased repetition, you will also get paraphrasing. We also do that in native speech when we don't understand what somebody says, or we want to put, in other words. It's a very common device that native speakers use, and it's hugely beneficial for students when you're trying to get them to comprehend certain things within the text. Another thing that you'll find in graded texts, and certainly the ones we use on Off the Class, are requests for clarification. That is something that goes on in any conversation, unless it's a monologue delivered in an academic environment, or perhaps somebody's giving a podcast where there's a question or two later on. But Chris, even you and I know when we speak, something that you have to do in a webinar is you have requests for clarification so that the message that I think I'm delivering is being understood. And Chris is there to kind of help me along with that. In the cases of these authentic texts, you'll find that the speakers themselves will often request things to be repeated or request things in other words. You also find, excuse me, more careful speech in text. And obviously the reason for this is that when we speak as native speakers, and I'm a classic case of this, I'm being as careful as I can now, understanding that there will be people perhaps who don't speak English as a native language and who are still very good English teachers, but they won't want me to be speaking in my broad Australian accent that I would use at home. So you'll find I'm using a more formal register. There's less hesitation. I try to speak more slowly so that I'm not jumping ahead of myself, and I will avoid using any slang or kind of street speech, if you want, to make sure that the largest number of people can comprehend the content. There's also a controlled context. Obviously, if you sit down at a restaurant and you're speaking with your friends, it's very clear that excuse me, this is not good. It's very clear that a conversation can jump all over the place. It's very quick to go off topic when you catch up with people. That doesn't work in the ESL world. You need to have a controlled context so that there's an ecosystem, a scenario, a scene in which the entire thing unfolds. Otherwise, it becomes students become incapable. There's actually a couple of lessons that we have about keeping people on topic. I can't remember exactly which lesson they're in, but that's another good form of skill in listening, and it's a speaking skill really, but we have it in one of our listening activities, is what do you do when people go on off topic? And that's a great skill for people particularly listening to as ESL learners to have as well. The final thing I want to mention, and this is not a negative thing, is what I call the TED Talk syndrome. First of all, I'm fairly sure that most of you are familiar with TED Talks. They're absolutely fantastic. The problem is, because they are so well put together and they are in a controlled context, we have many teachers think that the internet, and quite rightly so, is this enormous treasure trove of native speaker English. TED Talks are long, even if they're 5 or 20 minutes. Somebody can utter 5,000 words during that time, and even with the transcriptions that are written down with the TED Talks, I would say you need to be very careful about giving that kind of authentic English to students. It can be absolutely overwhelming for anybody, but at the highest level. So I guess what I'm saying is, what I call the TED Talk syndrome is just going out onto the internet and basically saying, well, anything that anybody delivers out there is authentic English. Unfortunately, it's just not. Okay, language for listening exercises. One thing that I noticed a lot of teachers overlook, and this isn't just related to off to class, is because listening activities tend to be something where you do the pre-listening activity and then you're going to press the play button. If that play button delivers a recording that's about a minute or longer, you really need to make sure that students have the language to stop you halfway through, and you really need to be prepared for that. Students can lose confidence very quickly when they lose train of a conversation, and remember that that's part and parcel of learning a new language. When you sit down with more than one learner and you're having to focus on different things, you soon lose the train of the conversation because you're focused on 3 words that were said before. Looking up your online dictionary, what did that mean? For anybody who's a language learner, we've all been in that situation. So just ensure at the very earliest stage, in the same way that students should be able to learn the alphabet and ask you how to spell a word, another trait that gets left behind in ESL teaching, these 3 very simple statements: stop, I don't understand, and can you play that again? Make sure that your student understands it at a very early stage. You don't want to play something for 2 minutes and they come back and they lost confidence 10 seconds in. Nothing's been done. Okay, probably stating the obvious, but I have a huge love of, well, not a love, I insist that students have a pen and paper, and I mean the physical stuff, no digital stuff that has a spell checker on it. It's actually getting back to old school. Having that with a listening activity, it's very, very beneficial for when you are doing pre-listening activities around eliciting information that the student already knows before playing the audio. And secondly, it gives you a wealth of information, because as students are listening to a recording, they can write things down. They can write down little snippets of words they understand, questions that we may not address in the teacher's notes, and that's particular to that student. So get them to write notes down and get them to do it on paper and not digital. Spelling is a great thing that can come from listening activities, because obviously I'm not going to go into the inconsistencies of English pronunciation and spelling. It's not the easiest language in the world to spell. So if a student writes down a word that they think they heard, and then you confirm the spelling and give them the correct spelling, they probably won't rewrite correctly again. They've got it. So that's just one simple benefit from paper and pen. I'm just going to take a break for 5 seconds again, because I'm going to get rid of this. Hold on.
Yeah, gosh, that's the exciting part of going live. You never know what's going to happen, and it's so tough, right? If you happen have a tickle in your throat.
Unbelievable. And I've been up, like, my day is already halfway over and it's been fine to this point. But anyway,
Yeah.
so James is going on vacation. This is a pre-listening activity. So elicitation, if you listen to the webinar I delivered about reading activities, eliciting everything before you actually do the activity at the task itself is paramount, because first of all, you want to know what a student, you want to learn what a student already knows about the task they're about to do. So images, obviously, we have plenty of them in Opta class. They do tell 1,000 words. You can already get them to predict what they're about to listen to, that you can ask them about the James in front of us here who's going on vacation, what his likes and dislikes are. You can start getting information around, I'm pretty sure he's going to be an active outdoors. Looks like he's going to Europe. He's definitely getting on a plane. Volcano is a bit of an odd one in there, but hey, people might know enough to think, where's he going? Which part of the world, perhaps even? Extract as much information. I cannot import enough the idea of getting as much as you can out of the student before listening. Get them to write down with the pen and paper the information that they're already extracting from these images. Again, here's another pre-listening activity. Okay, we've gone one step further. You probably know very well that there's a volcano in Sicily. So now what we're doing here is gently introducing some of the other language that's probably going to turn up in the listening itself. So before we had the idea of James, he's going on vacation, he's taking a plane. Here we've got a few, in this case, I guess they would be foreign unless you're an Italian speaker, but you've got a map. You can start talking about where he's going. You might even want to trace using the drawing tools if you can find the places on the map. It depends how much time you want to spend on it. But again, you'll be amazed at how much you can extract in a pre-listening activity. Then you're going to go on to what I would call listening for specific information. Listening for the gist. So here, what is really important is to get students to read the questions before they start listening to the activity. And I would say that most teachers do it in the other way around. They listen and answer the questions. It is vital, and you've got a really good idea here, again, of extracting more information if you can contextualize the questions here. So for example, if you're looking for how long is his vacation, well, you might even say to the student, what's a possible answer that you could be, what do you think James is going to say? Is he on a year-long backpacking thing, or does he look like, he's got a high-flying job and they've given him 2 weeks off? Given that you already know possibly those other words that have appeared in the island of Sicily, that he's going to visit all of that, he's clearly going to do it, maybe going to do it on a bike, partly on plane. You can start contextualizing the words that they are going to start listening for. And even the type of language. If you're saying that where does James live, we're going to be listening for what? A country, a city? Is it likely he's going to tell you a street? Don't know. Start getting the context of what they're going to be listening for. Then we've got a nice one here to go into specific information. So here, again, you would want to be getting the student to read and understand the information on the page before clicking play on the audio. Again, there might be things that they want to talk about. There's already something here to put it in its natural order, and you can ask the students here to explain why they want them to go into that order. Get them to write it down with the notepad and pen, and you've got a great comparison for them as they run through as well. The answers are already, their expected answers are already written down. Nice bright image to keep asking questions about various places as you go. Then I'm going to go on to something that I think appears, well, not I think, linking words and signpost language appear quite frequently in listening activities. Chris?
Yes, I wanted to just bring something up at this point. because everything you're sharing a lot of information,
Sure.
and you're talking about a lot of things that are not just on the slides. And so what I imagine is the struggle for teachers is if you have a teacher who is not necessarily the most experienced with listening activities, it's almost like we have to take a step back and be able to say it is okay to go deep on these things, right? Like I think most teachers go shallow, as in they do what's on the slide and then they move on. And they do the lesson, and the lesson takes 30 minutes, and they say, okay, well then I'll do a second lesson in this 1 hour lesson. Instead of saying, you know what, I can make one lesson take 4 sessions without it being boring. But I think that's what I'm just trying to imagine. What is a teacher afraid of? Are they afraid it's going to be boring? Are they afraid they don't know what to do? But I think these are just all great examples of like, don't be afraid to go deep and spend time.
And bring your own life experience into things. And I think I did mention it in the reading. Always remember that your ability to personalize something. If I showed that image prior, previous image that I showed that had James with the volcano, Europe, city, etc. around him, that may relate to the student's life in a way that you're not even familiar with. And if you have to spend, not even if you have the ability to get that student to talk about the last time they got on a plane, hey, somebody I know, did you hear about the recent volcano eruption? Whatever it is, as long as you're not going too far off the path, I think spend as much time as you can to set up any task so that the task itself becomes achievable for the student. And you will notice that the more you talk about James and getting on the plane and the volcano, answering those questions while listening, they're already listening for specific words because you've taken the time to set the task up. And I think that's it. Never be afraid. Listen, I would like to think that Class has created a curriculum that has ample teacher notes, but we are constrained by the amount of space that we can put there. And I also want students, it doesn't benefit teachers' own personal and professional growth to spoon feed them every single thing. Don't be limited by what we've put on the slides. We like to think we've given you a fantastic guide and base, but absolutely I agree with you. Set that task up for as much time as it takes so the student is confident going into a task that is achievable.
Okay, James, one more question, and this is a little bit maybe unanticipated. Because I'm trying to put myself in this perspective of I want to see this in action is the question that I have. I want to see, because even myself, right, I've been using off to class materials with real students for a long time, but I feel like as well as I know off to class, I'm sure I don't go as deep as I could. So what I wonder is, do you have recordings of yourself with real students doing these types of things?
Yes, it's some time since I did that, but the ability, obviously it's a great thing to be able to do. I remember teaching. Okay, I'm going to go off tangent. You bring me back on in a second, but I think it's really good. I think it's an excellent thing to do. You will learn so much about your engagement with the student from it doesn't have to be the whole lesson. Take a 5-minute recording, not the first 5 minutes while you're setting up. Take a 5-minute recording, get the permissions from the parents and all the rest of you work out the legalities of it. But the ability to watch yourself delivering a lesson, to observe yourself, and to allow somebody else, even if you're confident enough, got a good ESL friend to observe you, what you will get back from that will probably be better than any book you will read. For quite some time. There's so much to be gained from, it's a scary thing to observe yourself. I don't particularly like it, but I know as a teacher that I was what I used to call a personality teacher. I find it very easy to talk to people but I can go off task very quickly, and I would have talked through 80% of the lesson. And when I watched myself, I realized that the first thing that I had to do was to reduce my teacher talk time drastically, which I've now done. That also helped me to, compile the curriculum activities, realizing that, in fact, we should develop a curriculum or materials that can almost be understood by the student or are delivered in a way with repetition, with a certain pattern that students can start to work out for themselves what's coming next, and the teacher really becomes the guide and the facilitator. So absolutely, I think it doesn't matter which skill you're teaching. If you have the opportunity to record yourself, don't be too harsh on yourself when you watch it back. But take notes. There's a multitude of things you will see from learning from watching yourself in action, and the student.
Okay. Good aside. I'll let you get back to linking words and signpost language.
Right. Okay. For those of you who enjoy teaching writing, you will be super familiar with words. Signpost language is really the same thing, but obviously when we speak, in careful speech and careful writing, we tend to use a whole lot of signpost language that helps guide the reader or the listener through a conversation. So these tend to appear in graded texts. They allow the student to grab hold of something when a speaker is delivering a new point, in the same way that if a writer is introducing a contrasting point, they might use a different linking word there. So these are linking words and signpost language that will appear in listening texts in an ESL curriculum that will be more absent at higher levels of proficiency, and certainly at an informal register. These are things that will disappear because they're understood in the context. Things are provided by body language, and just because of the familiarity between the speakers, there's so much that's understood that these linking words aren't necessarily, they're no longer necessary. But whether you want to focus on them or not is another thing. I think they're great. And they can be very useful for students who are going to, for whom writing can be a problem, because they allow to clarify, they give you skills in coherency and certainly developing a logical argument that makes sense to the listener. Okay, and then the last thing I really wanted to speak about is for higher level students, the idea of listening to activities to find the speaker's opinion, and listening for tone and intonation. Now, some of these as a teacher, you might want to hold back on until you, or depending on your level of comfort of teaching these things. But I would also say, don't be scared of diving in. Lots of factors come into here, depending on the student's actual native language, and if I can say how different that is from the pronunciation or phonetic system of English, that will be something that can determine at what stage you would want to introduce this. A couple of them, so modeling and drilling, I don't know that they are so much in favor anymore, but it's still something that I think you should not be embarrassed to do as a teacher. It's okay after a listening exercise. In fact, I would even promote it that you might want to repeat certain phrases. It helps students to start to understand the difference between the stressed and the unstressed words in a phrase in English, and the ability, I'll skip to number 3 first of all, the idea that words in isolation in English, when a student will say, how do you pronounce a word? And you pronounce it, and you listen to the listening activity, and it doesn't quite sound the same. So as you guys know, unstressed syllables in English words all get reduced to in lots of cases. So it's very good to focus on a single word for the pronunciation, but then have that word in context in a stressed, unstressed position, whatever you want. I think that's something that's really beneficial, especially as you get higher levels of proficiency in the student. It helps with the naturalness and the delivery of the speech. Back to number 2, increasing the speed and naturalness. Again, that's also something that you can do with modeling and drilling. Don't be afraid to get a student to, you need to bring out the actor in anybody. And one of the things that you can do is help them speak in a tone that makes them feel comfortable. And often that means adopting the role of the speech that they're about to deliver. In a curriculum, there will be a multitude of people speaking from a whole lot of backgrounds. We've got James on holiday. It might be an academic professor. It could be 2 friends meeting in the street. You want to set the context and get them repeating it over and over again until they feel comfortable. It also helps them with listening to themselves there as well. Altering emphasis and stress. English is a great language. Well, all languages are great, but English is a language in which you can move stress around in the words or place stress on a particular word, and it will change the focus of the sentence. Question forms are an ideal example of this type of thing, where you can, why did she do that? Why did she do that? Why did she do that? All of those change ever so slightly the meaning. So at higher levels of proficiency, if you've got something like that in the listening activity, you can muck around with that a lot and get the student to focus on how would I change, how could I change the meaning of the question, for example, by changing the stress, where the stress falls in the sentence. And to be fair, I've already focused on, I mentioned number 5 in passing, is I think it's really important after a listening activity. Don't be afraid to get your students to kind of act out something similar. If you do want to share the transcription, you can even, and we do in some of the listening activities, we go on after a listening for gist activity. You might listen for specific information where the students are doing a close activity and just filling in gaps. Then they will have the full transcript in front of them, but that doesn't occur in all cases. And why not act that out with the students and give them the possibility, after hearing a native speaker speak it, for them to actually do the same thing as close as best they can. I covered a lot, not in depth, but I love teaching listening activities. I love teaching listening skills, and I think it's something that really benefits students. One of the biggest advantages, probably, here we go again, that I didn't mention previously, is that if you have a really good relationship with your student, it's going to be partially because they understand you. It means that they're going to get most of their English from one source that they've gained their confidence with. That's a great thing, that you keep your student because your student understands you, but using listening activities is a way for you to open up the students' skill set, because they will listen to different accents in different registers about topics about which you wouldn't perhaps normally speak yourself, and it does help them broaden their listening skills. So that, as I mentioned you before, Chris, one of probably the most disappointing things that can happen with a student who loves you, been teaching them for ages, they finally get out there in the world, and their first experience in English, they come back and said, "Oh God, I didn't understand anything." It's not going to always reflect back on you, but just remember that you, as an English teacher, you probably speak continuously in a controlled manner. You do speak only one way, no matter how much you play the actor. So having as many voices as possible within the ESL environment is of great benefit. You're doing your students a huge service.
Yeah, the one thing that I thought was an interesting kind of jumping off point to maybe go in a different direction, but which was so interesting, was when you talked about the TED Talk syndrome. If you were to Google how to teach listening, right? Tips on teaching listening. So many people say, have your students listen to TED Talks, TED Talks, TED Talks. It's so prevalent. But so I'm aware of one big pitfall, but that's not even the one that you raised, right? The one that you raised, which is interesting, was that, look, these are so long. They're so long, and they're really like advanced. But the other thing that I was thinking of, and I was wondering about your opinion on this. When you get to more advanced students, and students talk about not being able to understand what's happening in a meeting, for example, how a TED Talk is very poor practice for that, because in a TED Talk, there's no fast, informal English being spoken. And you did right. There's no us. There's none of this thing that people very frequently do, where, and I do this all the time. I start a sentence, but then I get like 6 words into my sentence, and then I decide that I'm going to change the direction of my sentence entirely, so my sentence just stops, and then I say something completely different. And so and then I say, but no, but then I actually, what I think I know, this is my point. And there's all of this audio static that's in there, which is, you're not going to get that in a TED Talk. And so I don't want to ask you, well, what do people do for that? Because that really is the highest of the high levels before someone is ready for that. But just another reason that, a TED Talk is maybe for a lot of reasons less than ideal.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to put them down in any way, because the intention of TED Talks is not to get ESL speakers
right.
listening skills. And I can see why in the world of the internet that they are, so highly recommended by teachers, and they do certainly serve for students who perhaps want a more in-depth knowledge, understanding of a particular topic. It's great. But again, like you said, they are so controlled. There is a particular format, absolutely, and it works, but they are not designed for ESL students, and I do think the length of them can be quite off-putting for students. There isn't, an ideal length of time, but obviously if you're a teacher in a lesson with a student, I think a minute and a half to 2 minutes is the longest you want to be going, without stopping that recording, checking for feedback, checking for comprehension. And so what you said about, hesitations, interruptions, losing track, coming back. I put this snippet in here that from our IELTS lesson about distractors, and it's something that it actually is tested in IELTS. In native speech, we are distracted so often that when we talk to somebody, it's common for us to correct ourselves or to correct somebody in the conversation.
Yeah.
And it's actually something that you need to be able to listen for. And of course, they are almost completely absent from something like TED Talks, but
right.
They are vital. Listening for distractors actually gets tested in IELTS because it's an essential part of listening skills. So yeah, the internet's an amazing source, obviously, of native, but don't get lazy with it.
Yeah. So my biggest takeaway is not even about the listening, as much as it is about not being afraid to go deep into the lessons, and not just going slide by slide, and knowing that everything on that slide is not there to be a complete and perfect activity, but is there to simply be a starting point for you to go deeper with students.
Absolutely. I would say, our goal as curriculum writers is to get students at the end of a lesson to reach the objective of that lesson, whether that is to be able to use can and could when expressing ability.
Yeah.
It's your job as a teacher to use your imagination, your understanding of the student, and whatever the student hands you as extra information to adapt that lesson. And that's where the personalization comes in. That's where a higher level of engagement comes in. And that's where, if you're an online teacher, the retention comes in. It's hard to differentiate yourself. It's becoming harder to differentiate yourself in a market. And obviously, I love that people use the off-to-class materials. But then how do you, a student likes off-to-class materials. How do you differentiate yourself as a teacher? Go deep, adapt, and make the student do the work by giving you as much information as you can to set up those tasks so that they are achievable and enjoyable. Keeps motivation increased, etc.
Fantastic. Well, James, thank you so much for your time and for sharing this information with us. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to the next one when we take on another skill.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.
All right. Bye, everyone.